Alright, hello and welcome back. This is the last episode in the Leviathan's Hybernia series. We're going to look at the project as a whole in Editor, look at some of the blueprints and how they work, and kind of examine some of the different devices that are used to guide the player through the level, and how a lot of what game design is creating the illusion of various things in the mind of the player. But for now, let's just go ahead and jump right in. So, the first thing that I hardly even need to point out is the obvious. This is not a coastal coast. This is not a shoreline. This is not an actual landmass. There is no horizon, right? This is what the Hybernia actually looks like. And I can change that to lit. There we go. That's a little bit more recognizable. This is what the Hybernia actually looks like. But when we look at it from a lot closer perspective, and by a lot closer, I mean a lot closer. There we go. And now it starts to form. Now it looks like there is a horizon. Just because we're so low to the surface of the water, and the water surface is so big that it just looks like it extends to the horizon, but it really doesn't. And these cliffs look like they bend around the corner, but in reality, if we go and look at them, they just kind of do nothing. They don't even have a backside. They're just pretend, you know? And the top of the cliff, absolutely nothing there. You know, and so it's all about perspective. Most video games, especially first-person games, use this quite a bit. They make you believe that there's a lot more that's there than what you can see. You know, it's creating the illusion of the player actually being in this location, right? And so that is here. It looks like this water is fairly deep in some places, but it's really not. See, we're already below the ocean floor. You know? That object that was the ocean floor is like right here. It's about this deep. You know? And it just looks like it's a bit deeper in some places just because of the way that the texture sits. And so there's a lot of illusion going on behind the scenes of game design. So the player will start, and they enter, and they come up to this volume here. And when the player crosses into this volume, it shifts the camera perspective to this right here, and it pulls up that handler dialogue where the handler explains all of the things. And then after the dialogue, the player is able to walk through here, and they'll hit this first checkpoint, and it'll say Leviathan's Hybernia, right? And then they will be able to interact with this first puzzle. Now, when the player, let's take a look at the puzzle. So the puzzle has a lot of different components. The first component that the player will interact with is this platform. Now, all this platform does is it sends a communication whenever it's overlapped, whenever something overlaps it. You see it's got this big capsule here. Whenever anything overlaps that capsule, if it'll cast it to the BP Scrapper, which is the player character. So if that is the player, right, and that succeeds, then it will, for each assigned hub, it will run satellite trigger. And then this is the exact same thing whenever component end overlaps, and whenever it stops overlapping. If that thing that stops overlapping is the player, it will also run this satellite trigger for each hub in the array. Now, if we look, there we go, BP, the hub array I have assigned to this column platform right here. So whenever the player steps on or off of this, it communicates with this, and what it says is satellite trigger. So whenever satellite trigger is called, it happens, then it will do all of these things. And it will get all of the columns that are on that platform. So for this puzzle, you can see column array. There's only one, and it's that one right there. For each column on there, it will toggle the color. And so whenever you step on or off the satellite platform, or you step on or off the actual platform, it will change the color of each column, and then it will change the color of each activator from black to whatever the color is. The other thing that it does is this platform, this main platform here, has 4 boxes. You see these invisible boxes here? And what those do is those serve as the boundary. So that if the column gets moved outside of here, right? So, nope, there we go. So if on component begin overlap, right, we're going to check to see if it's the column. And if it is the column, we're going to have that column revert itself to its original location. And so that's all that happens with that column, that base platform. That's it. Now, the column itself is a little bit more complicated. And in order to explain that, we need to look at these interface and the buttons. So the player walks up, triggers that, changes the colors. Then the player will be able to interact with these buttons. Now, each of these buttons is going to be set to a directional. And we can see that right here. So directional, F. So that button is set to forward. So whenever you push that button, right, here we go, there's feedback. The first thing that it'll do is it'll animate that button squishing down and then coming back up, right? The second thing that it'll do is it'll play a clicking sound. And then, if there's an error, it will print a error string to the message, or to the screen. But if it's not, if there's not an error, if the button is assigned to an interface, then it will use that interface and it will run input, which is a function on that interface that we'll look at in just a second, and it will pass in that capital F, which is the directional here, into that function. And that's where the interface will take over. So there's input, right? So what it's going to do now is whenever one of those buttons is pushed, it's going to run this input, and it's going to have that direction, right? Now, what it's going to do is if the column that is assigned to that interface is able to move, meaning that it hasn't been put in over the correct activator and locked itself into position, if it can move, then it is going to set the variable directional of that column to the directional value that that button passed in. And then it will call on trigger of that column. So what that means is event triggered happens, right? And because we set this column's current directional value to capital F for forward, it's going to pass that directional value into execute move. And then it will run execute move. So the first thing that it wants to find out is directional. Well, first off, it wants to find out if the column is already moving. If the column is in motion, when this gets run again, when this gets called again, we don't want it to call itself again, because sometimes, because of the way that the interact works in this SCRAPS project, the way that it's set up, when you interact with a button, it'll sometimes call it like 50 times in a row. And so I added a Boolean switch so that it'll only process one line of command at a time, or one input at a time. So if it is moving and it gets called again, I want to check and see if the directional is equal to reset. Because you remember when the column leaves the bounds of the puzzle, the hub platform will call reversion. We'll call the column's reversion function. And that reversion function is right here. So how it works is whenever reversion is called, it will run a toggle. Now, pull this up. Okay. So, isDeath applies to is this instance of this function being called have to do with the player dying? And if it does, then we're going to set can move to true. And we're going to run execute move, but notice direction is reset. So essentially, if it's moving, if it's already in motion, we are going to set, oh, hey, it can move now, to true. And we're going to execute move reset. And when we execute move reset, execute move, it's already in motion. So we're going to check to see if that directional is reset. If it is reset, then we're going to stop the column moving. And when we stop the column moving, oh, that's a function. Oh no, there we go. Then we just stop all of the, if it's in progress, it stops being in progress. And then it just sets it back to its original location and plays a sound. So yeah, this can get pretty darn complicated. There's a lot of timelines. Each one of these is a different direction that it could be, and it's controlled by this Boolean system of if-else checks that could have more easily been controlled by a state machine, as I've been learning, but I didn't know that at the time. So as it is, it's just a mess. But that is basically how this puzzle works. And then when the column, the correct column, is put on the pedestal of the matching color, it will check those colors, and if they're equal, excuse me, if they're equal, then it will send a activation signal to something else, or to whatever it's assigned to. In this case, it is this front door here, and it causes this button to light up with that red ring. And then when that is pushed, it opens the elevator and allows the player to go downstairs into the rest of the level. So a couple of other things that I just want to point out. We're not going to go through absolutely every detail of this, but I want to talk about the oil level. So the oil level also should have been run on a state machine, but as it is, I managed to code in 3 separate phases, 3 separate triggers. This is the first one. And when this puzzle is complete, it'll start dumping the oil will start pumping out of here, and it'll start raising the oil level until the oil gets to about this high, and then it'll stop. And it will stop there until the player pulls this from the generator, at which point the oil level will begin rising again, and it will rise up to about here. And so the player has to get through all of this before the oil level crests over that low section there. And then the third is right here. This is a trigger volume. Nope. Trigger volume. There. That's a trigger volume. When the player enters through that, it'll cue the oil to go into its third phase, which is when it rises the fastest, and the player really has to just start booking. So that is how that all works. Now I've got the oil set on some instance editable variables. Where is it? There it is. There's the oil level here. So I can set the speed. Oh yeah, that's way too slow. Anyway, I could just mess with this and set the speed, make it faster, make it slower. This is where I set how high it goes on each one. And so it's pretty straightforward if you know what you're doing. And if you don't, then it can be overwhelming and complicated to get all the alarms to queue at the same time and all of this stuff. But I want to look at a couple of things that really just draw the player's eyes from one place to the next and show the player, as is one of the primary points of level design, this is the way that you need to go. So the first one is the lights. That the lights are just so obvious, especially right here. This bright light that I was talking about earlier. And then this one here, you enter, where you're at is a little bit darker, and then you see distant lights coming through here. These rails are very, very helpful for this because they just point you in the direction that you're supposed to be going. You know, this light illuminates this gate that is at the point where you get here, and the gate is open. There'll be all these flashing lights and stuff going on. Right, and then you've got these lines in the form of the rails that bring you on up, and then you've got a pipe guiding you this way, and then more pipes guiding you around this corner here, right? And then you got the puzzle, and then after you solve the puzzle, this will open, and there'll be flashing lights here, and then this is illuminated by a very dim red light, and then this becomes interactable, and you go and you grab that, and then the gate opens, and then you're told to evacuate, and it's all just one thing leading into another thing, leading into another thing, leading into another thing, until ultimately the player finds themselves out looking at the moon. But anyway, so yeah, that's just kind of a brief look under the hood at the Leviathan's Hybernia and some of the things that were incorporated in it. Kind of a behind-the-scenes look at a little bit of actual game design that I've been working on and been doing myself. I, again, I've made a lot of aesthetic changes since the team touched the project last. But everybody did a lot of really good work. I was really glad with how it turned out. Props to the rest of the team, guys. We did it. There was a lot of close calls, a lot of push deadlines, but ultimately it worked out really well. We did a lot of really good work. And I'm glad to be able to showcase this here for everybody to see. So thanks to the team. Thanks to you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. Next video, we'll be getting back into our Skyrim playthrough. But for now, thanks for watching. Thank you.